The fluorescent lights hummed above Sacred Heart Hospital's pediatric ward like insects trapped in plastic coffins. 3 in the morning. The kind of hour when the world forgets you exist. Katie Rodriguez folded blankets on the supply cart with hands that moved like surgical instruments. Each crease exact. 90-degree angles. Hospital corners tight enough to bounce a coin. Her fingers traced the creases twice, muscle memory from 18 years ago when those same hands had folded dress uniforms instead of pediatric linens. The tremor in her hands was barely visible. Someone would have to be looking very carefully to see it. Someone would have to understand what trembling hands that maintained perfect precision actually meant. She wore navy scrubs 2 sizes too large. Her badge was clipped backwards, photo side against her ribs. The name visible on the front read Katie Rodriguez, RN, Pediatric Care. What it didn't say was Major. What it didn't say was the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, Night Stalkers, or Task Force 121 Kandahar, or Classified Commendation redacted beyond recognition. Around her neck on a broken chain hung a single dog tag that she touched once every hour without thinking about it. The touch was automatic as breathing. The dog tag belonged to someone else. She'd never explained why she wore it. A limp marked her left side. Not pronounced. Not the kind that made people stare. The kind that appeared only after standing for 12 hours, only in the 3rd hour of a double shift, only when she thought no one was watching. Her left leg had been reconstructed by an army surgeon at Landstuhl with titanium pins and deliberate understatement. The scars on her forearms, thin white lines like calligraphy written in pain, she covered with long sleeves even in Portland summer when the ER temperature climbed to 82 degrees and everyone else wore short sleeves rolled to the elbows. No one asked about the scars. No one asked about the limp. No one asked why a pediatric nurse with perfect certifications had a classified security clearance buried so deep in the hospital's background check database that the Human Resources Director had flagged it as an error. No one asked because Katie Rodriguez had perfected the art of being invisible. 18 months at Sacred Heart and she existed in the space between notice and forgetting. She was restocking the crash cart on the pediatric ward, pediatric equipment, smaller sizes, doses calculated for bodies that weighed 60 pounds instead of 200, when she glanced through the supply room window toward the pharmacy archives on the 3rd floor. It was 2 in the morning. The archive should have been locked. The lighting should have been off. But the glow of a phone screen illuminated a face she recognized. Dr. Marcus Caldwell, Chief of Emergency Medicine. The man who'd stood before the hospital board 3 months ago and delivered a speech about excellence and standards and how Sacred Heart maintained the highest protocols in the Pacific Northwest. The phone screen glow painted his face cold blue as he photographed the files in front of him. Patient files. Restricted files. Her hand stopped moving. The blanket she'd been folding dropped to the cart. She watched through the reinforced glass as Caldwell pocketed his phone and straightened the files with methodical precision. He adjusted them to match their original angles. A careful man. A man who'd learned not to leave evidence. A man who understood what he was doing violated something fundamental. Then he looked up. His eyes moved across the 3rd floor pharmacy space and stopped directly at the supply room window 3 floors below. He saw her watching him. She saw him see her. The moment stretched like pulled taffy. His jaw tightened. His hand moved to his side pocket where the phone was. Then his mouth curved into something that wasn't a smile. It was the expression a predator makes when it realizes the mouse has noticed it. Katie looked back down at the blanket. She didn't move. She didn't blink. She picked up the folded blanket as if she'd never stopped, never noticed, never made eye contact with a man who now understood exactly what she'd witnessed. Her hands resumed their measured work. Fold. Crease. Stack. Fold. Crease. Stack. The tremor in her fingers was sharper now. She could feel it. The slight quiver in her left index finger. She made a fist to stop it. Then released. Breathed. Resumed. By 7 in the morning when day shift arrived, the pediatric ward schedule had been rewritten. Katie's 70-hour shift rotations were changed to swing shifts. Her assignments were shifted to different units. Her familiar rhythm, nights in pediatrics, where she knew every medication, every protocol, every child's name and condition, was erased and replaced with a rotating assignment system that no one could quite explain. Human Resources said there'd been a computer error. The scheduling system said it was a staffing adjustment. The notice was posted on the staff board without her name appearing anywhere. She stood in front of the schedule at 6:58 a.m., reading the names of the nurses assigned to pediatric nights. None of them were hers. Her shift now read ER Trauma Bay, rotation TBD, effective immediately. The Trauma Bay. Where Dr. Caldwell spent most of his mornings. Where the complicated cases arrived. Where nothing was routine. Where visible competence could be scrutinized by a man who now had motivation to scrutinize very carefully. The automatic doors of the ER opened at 7:32 a.m., and the world changed shape. The ambulance bay doors slammed open. 2 paramedics pushed a stretcher. The patient on it was a man in his late 60s with a strong jaw and military bearing even as his body failed. His left hand made rapid movements, signing. The paramedics ignored the signs. The nursing staff at the triage desk looked confused. One of them was saying something about communication barriers before the patient had even reached the trauma bay. Katie heard the voice from the pediatric ward before she saw the patient. Dr. Caldwell was already in motion, already directing the paramedics, already reading the transfer papers from St. Vincent Medical Center in Vancouver. The patient's vital signs were printed in bold letters across the front of the chart. Heart ejection fraction at 30%. Transplant rejection. Cardiac function failing. The patient was deaf. Katie registered this detail in the way he wasn't responding to the paramedics' shouted questions, the way his hand signed and nobody signed back, the way his eyes scanned the faces around him looking for understanding. And then he looked at her. The moment compressed. 18 years. All of it. The night in Kandahar when orders came down through the radio, the moment she recognized they were wrong, the moment she'd moved her team anyway because soldiers were dying and orders didn't matter when soldiers were dying. The court-martial. The closed hearing. The tribunal room where this man, older than, uniform pristine, voice-edged with command, had testified about insubordination. About disobeying direct orders. About the dangers of individual soldiers thinking they knew better than command authority. She'd stood in dress blues and listened to him explain to the tribunal why she was a liability. And they'd agreed. The discharge had been medical, honorable, but absolute. She'd left Kandahar erased. The patient on the stretcher was Marcus Webb. Not a name she'd seen in 18 years. Not a face she'd prepared to ever see again. A retired Green Beret. A deaf combat veteran whose hands were signing questions to a room of people who didn't understand sign language. A man whose brown eyes had locked onto hers for just a moment before Dr. Caldwell moved between them and began his assessment with the particular confidence of a man who had no idea who he was excluding from the room. What happened next changed everything. But Katie Rodriguez didn't move. She didn't freeze. She didn't let the recognition show on her face. She'd been trained for situations worse than this. Situations where mortars fell and surgical lights swung and a 19-year-old private was bleeding out on a field surgical table in Kandahar. She could manage a moment of surprise. She could manage a man who'd once destroyed her career walking back into her life on a stretcher, failing, in a hospital where she'd already learned to be invisible. She stepped back into the shadows of the ER corridor and watched from the distance. Dr. Caldwell spoke. The paramedics transferred the patient to the trauma bed. The monitors were attached. The chaos of arrival settled into the organized chaos of assessment. And through it all, Marcus Webb's hands continued to sign. Continued to search for someone who understood. Continued to move in the language of the only community that had never abandoned him. Katie touched the dog tag at her throat once. Then she turned and walked toward the supply room to restock the crash cart for a trauma bay where she was no longer scheduled to work. The crash cart rolled without a sound down the fourth-floor corridor, and Katie checked the defibrillator pads for the third time that morning even though she'd checked them at 6 a.m. Muscle memory. Hands that had held lives together across 2 continents moved through the motions with the same precision they'd learned in field kits and tactical medicine courses that officially never existed. She was restocking the 4 tray when the overhead speaker crackled, and her hand stilled for exactly 1 heartbeat. Nurse nobody to the pit. Nurse nobody to the pit. The voice was clinical, detached, the kind used for routine page announcements. But the entire 4th floor heard it. The pediatrics unit went quiet the way rooms go quiet when something shameful has been spoken aloud. Katie felt the weight of 17 sets of eyes, residents, nurses, orderlies, even a visiting cardiologist, all turning toward her simultaneously. Her patient, a 5-year-old boy with severe asthma, looked up from his tablet. "Is that you?" he asked with a directness only children possess. "Is your name really Nobody?" Katie kept her gaze on the 4 line she was checking. The metal cabinet beside her bed reflected her face back in silver, pale, composed, untouched by the humiliation spreading through the ward like a stain. She saw 2 residents smirk near the nursing station. Saw Dr. Patterson pause mid-conversation and glance in her direction with the satisfied expression of someone who'd just watched a dog get kicked. A single tear formed at the corner of her left eye. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with her reflection, her movements so controlled they seemed choreographed. Then she taped the 4 in place and continued her work in silence, moving methodically through the rest of her morning rounds as if the overhead speaker had called out someone else's name entirely. The pit was what they called the supply closet on the 3rd floor, a nickname that had nothing to do with maintenance and everything to do with the fact that nobody wanted to be found there. Katie descended the stairwell at shift change, when the chaos of afternoon arrivals was thick enough to provide cover. She needed sterile gauze, replacement syringes, and the kind of anonymity that came with being underground. The supply closet door was propped open. She was 3 steps inside when Dr. Caldwell appeared in the doorway behind her, blocking out the hallway light. "You have some interesting gaps in your employment history, Rodriguez." His voice carried the texture of someone who'd been building toward this conversation for hours. "I was curious about you this morning. Pulled your file from HR, thought I'd do my due diligence on the staff." He stepped inside and let the door swing nearly shut behind him, leaving just enough space to feel legal. 2015 to 2019. For years. Nothing. You weren't working anywhere in Oregon, Washington, or California. No record. Like you vanished. Katie's hands continued moving through the supply bins. Gauze. Syringes. Tape. The kind of work that required no response. That's suspicious, you understand. Makes me wonder what you were actually doing. Prison, maybe? Some kind of institutional stay? He moved closer, not quite invading her space but close enough that she could smell the cologne he wore, something expensive, the kind that cost more than her weekly paycheck. Or maybe a psych ward. Some facilities don't like to put that in the public record. I'm thinking a transfer to county might be appropriate. They don't ask as many questions. They're used to people with your kind of history. Each word landed like a calculated strike, designed not to draw blood but to make her flinch. Katie's breathing remained steady, measured. The supply closet was perhaps 8 feet by 6, lined with shelves that held the infrastructure of modern medicine. Oxygen masks. Compression wraps. Airway equipment. Things designed to keep bodies alive. The air smelled like plastic and something faintly medicinal, almost sterile. She picked up a box of syringes and turned to face him directly. I've triaged combat wounds in the dark while mortars fell. Her voice was barely above a whisper, the kind of quiet that forces people to lean in. Held a 19-year-old's intestines together with my hands while artillery rounds shook the building. My opinion about my employment history is not one you need to have. Your opinion about anything is just noise. The smile on Caldwell's face didn't reach his eyes. It was the smile of a predator who'd poked something in a cage and gotten an unexpected response. He stepped back slightly, his expression shifting into something harder. "We'll see, Rodriguez. We'll see what the administration thinks about your attitude." He left the supply closet, and Katie stood among the shelves for several seconds without moving. Outside, somewhere in the hospital, monitors beeped their mechanical rhythm. Ventilators wheezed. The fluorescent light above her head hummed with an almost organic persistence. She had survived Kandahar. She had survived a court-martial in a room full of hostile officers who'd been ordered to make an example of her. She had survived 18 years of being nobody to everyone. She could survive a supply closet confrontation with a doctor who smelled like expensive cologne and resentment. But that wasn't the worst part. The next morning, the physician's parking lot was full by 7:15. Katie stood at the edge of the asphalt in a yellow safety vest that hung loose on her frame, holding a grabber tool that made her look like someone who'd been assigned to clean up after the world. The vest had facilities printed on the back in reflective letters. Caldwell had announced her new schedule during a staff meeting. She wasn't invited to janitorial rotation, effective immediately, for hours daily, parking lot and common areas. No one had asked her opinion. No one had consulted HR. It was a punishment delivered through administrative action, the kind that left no paper trail of explicit hostility. Dr. Patterson arrived at 7:23 driving a Range Rover with tinted windows. As he passed through the parking lot on his way to the entrance, his coffee cup traveled from his hand to the asphalt near Katie's feet. The cup landed with a splash of dark liquid spreading across white concrete. He didn't pause. Didn't acknowledge the gesture. Just kept walking, his expensive shoes clicking against the pavement in a rhythm that sounded like laughter. Katie picked up the cup. The coffee inside was still warm. She could see Caldwell watching from his office window on the third floor, watching her bend to retrieve what had been discarded, watching her place it in the trash bin with the careful respect usually reserved for injured animals. 17 doctors would pass through this parking lot today. 17 opportunities to see the pediatric nurse in a yellow vest, and none of them would see anything worth seeing. Her hands didn't shake as she straightened up. Her breathing remained even. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the precise control of someone who understood that visible anger would confirm every suspicion Caldwell had planted. So instead, she picked up her tool and continued moving through the parking lot with the methodical focus of someone performing a necessary task. That night, as she drove home through rain that hammered the windshield like applause, Katie's phone buzzed with a work notification. New admission. Trauma Bay. Patient name Marcus Webb. Age 62. Diagnosis, acute cardiac rejection, EF 30%. Transplant status, pending review. She pulled over at a red light and stared at the name on her screen for 7 seconds. Marcus Webb. The officer who'd testified against her. The Green Beret who'd stood in front of a tribunal 18 years ago and declared her unfit for command. The man whose career recommendation had ended hers, whose voice had been steady and authoritative as he described her dangerous impulsivity and disregard for chain of command, whose presence in that courtroom had felt like a second execution. He was in her hospital now. He was dying. And Dr. Caldwell was already assigning his case. The light changed. Katie drove forward into the rain, her dog tags pressed against her chest beneath her scrubs, and she understood with sudden, crystalline clarity that Caldwell's campaign had just shifted into something far more sophisticated than public humiliation. The chart told the story that the doctors wouldn't read. Ejection fraction dropping. 28%. 26, 24. The numbers fell like a countdown to a consequence nobody wanted to acknowledge. Katie stood in the hallway outside Marcus Webb's room at 11 p.m. on the third night, her eyes moving across the screen in front of her, fluid accumulating in both lung fields, kidneys beginning to slip toward failure, electrolytes betraying the muscle that had kept him alive for 53 years. The fluorescent strips above cast everything in a pale blue that made the vital signs look worse than they probably were. Probably. She'd changed into scrubs she kept in a locker in the basement, the one she'd brought from home because Dr. Caldwell's official order had been explicit: janitorial staff did not enter patient care areas. The parking lot assignment had been deliberate, public, timed for maximum visibility. She'd been escorted out of the building in front of the morning shift, the arriving nurses and residents watching her push a mop bucket across asphalt still wet from the Portland rain. The message was clear: this is what happens when you step out of line. Nobody. The nickname had legs now. It had reached every floor. But Helen, the charge nurse on nights, was 73 years old and had worked at Sacred Heart since 1989, and she remembered when hospitals had had backbones. Helen had simply forgotten to enforce the restriction when Katie arrived at 11, sliding into the staff room with her badge clipped to her scrub pocket, looking neither left nor right. "Oh," Helen had said, glancing up from her charting. "Didn't Caldwell text that the restriction was lifted?" "Must have missed it." It wasn't a request. It was a command disguised as forgetfulness. Helen had patted her shoulder, the touch light enough to seem accidental, and turned back to her work. Katie had understood. Some people could read a uniform even when it wore civilian clothes. What the chart showed was a man running out of time. Marcus Webb, the file read. 72 hours post-transplant rejection. Status: unimproving. No family listed as emergency contact. No advance directives on file. No advocate. The system had decided he was uncomplicated to let go. Dr. Caldwell had been the first refusal, at 6 a.m. on day 1. He'd walked into Marcus's room, seen the deaf green beret trying to communicate with the resident, attempting to sign with hands that were already beginning to swell from fluid retention, and Caldwell had stepped back, his mouth moving in words designed to carry non-compliant. Can't follow verbal commands. Too much risk. He'd written it in the chart in underlined ink. Non-compliant. As if Marcus's inability to hear constituted a character flaw. Dr. Patterson had come at 2 p.m. on day 1 with his tablet and his algorithm. Communication barriers, he'd announced to no one in particular. Without reliable communication protocols, we can't obtain informed consent for any interventions. We're exposed. The word exposed had made him sweat. Katie had watched from the doorway as he'd left without touching Marcus, without looking at the notepad where Marcus had written his military service number, his unit designation, his request for treatment in careful block letters. Dr. Hughes had arrived on day 2 with his certainty intact. Combative, he declared after Marcus had grabbed his arm, a desperate attempt to make contact, to make someone actually see him. One grab, and the diagnosis was final. Combative. The word in the chart made Marcus sound like a feral animal, not a man drowning inside his own body. Dr. Raines had come next with the language of psychology. Psychiatric risk, she'd said, noting the depression that would be natural in any patient abandoned by 6 physicians in succession. She'd recommended a psychiatric consultation. Katie had watched the psychiatrist come and go, a young resident with a clipboard, 30 seconds of observation, a note about appropriate caution given behavioral presentation. The consultation had been thorough in its absence of help. Dr. Okonkwo had arrived with the weight of institutional caution. Liability concerns, she'd said carefully. If we proceed and the outcome is poor, questions might be raised about consent. Whether he truly understood the risks given the communication limitations. The word consent had been underlined twice in her notes, as if consent could be manufactured through punctuation. Dr. Singh had delivered his refusal with the efficiency of someone reading a script. Insufficient resources, he'd stated. The cardiac unit was at capacity. The dialysis machines were booked. The interventional lab had scheduled procedures through the week. Not enough. Everything was insufficient. Marcus was insufficient. Dr. Martinez had been the last to see him, and he'd simply walked out of the room without speaking. No explanation. No notation in the chart beyond a timestamp. The silence of abandonment was somehow worse than all the words that had come before. 7 refusals. Katie had counted them the way someone counts losses. 1 for each hour of sleep she wasn't getting. One for each time she'd made the mistake of thinking that the oath to do no harm might actually mean something. At 1 a.m., she was charting vitals when she saw Marcus writing on a notepad, his hand shaking in the way that suggested pain or fear or the particular terror of a man whose body was betraying him while the people around him refused to acknowledge his humanity. He'd written his name. Then his rank. Then, "I know you." The note was addressed to Katie, who he'd seen in the hallway an hour earlier, her face visible through the door window for exactly 3 seconds before she'd moved on. It wasn't enough time for recognition. Yet he'd known. Somehow, he'd known. Katie had not gone into the room. She'd read the note from the hallway as he held it up against the glass, and she'd felt something in her chest tighten like a fist. At 2 a.m., his heart rate became irregular. The monitor showed ectopic beats, the rhythm fragmented like a piece of music losing its tempo. Katie pulled his full chart and found the connection she'd been avoiding since he'd arrived: Green Beret retired. Kandahar deployment 2006 to 2008. Court-martial board president. His signature was 3 pages into the tribunal documentation that should have been sealed, buried, erased along with the entire operation that had gotten 14 men out of an ambush alive while she'd violated his direct order to stand down, moved her team forward, extracted casualties under fire, and paid the price of insubordination when the Pentagon decided that the mission never happened, and neither did she. She remembered his testimony. She remembered his face as he'd read the charges. She remembered the sound of her rank being stripped, the words spoken in a room with no windows and one exit that only opened to disappearance. The transplant team had refused to list him. The documentation had been terse: patient demonstrates insufficient social support and communication barriers limiting post-operative monitoring compliance. Translation: nobody wants him to live. He was a problem, and the easiest solution was to let nature solve it. Katie was reading the rejection notes at 2:16 a.m. when she felt Dr. Caldwell's presence materialize behind her in the hallway like cold moving into a room. She didn't turn. She didn't have to. His voice came soft and layered with satisfaction. "I told you to stay away from patient care areas. You're on thin ice, nobody. One more step and you're done." She closed the chart. Slowly. The cover made a sound like the end of something. Katie turned to face him, and her jaw was level, her eyes the color of September slate, and when she spoke her voice had dropped half an octave from the deferential tone she'd perfected over 18 months of invisibility. "That patient's ejection fraction is 22%. His kidneys are failing. 7 physicians have written refusals. The transplant team has abandoned him. He's going to arrest within the next 6 hours unless someone actually reads the chart instead of reading the label on the patient." She paused. "One breath. You might want to check on him occasionally. You know, as a doctor." Caldwell's face went the color of old rust. His hand came up as if he was going to point, or grab, or make some physical punctuation of his authority. Katie didn't move. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The particular discipline of someone who'd trained for years to be more dangerous than angry. He'd lowered his hand. He'd stepped back. And then he'd walked away without speaking, because there were witnesses, a night resident passing through, a nursing student at the far end of the hallway, and he couldn't afford to be seen losing control to a janitorial staff member who was supposedly nobody. When he'd gone, Katie had gone back to reading the chart, to the numbers that were falling like rain, to the man in the room whose body was rejecting everything offered, including the possibility of mercy. At 3 a.m., Caldwell had returned with his real weapon. He'd pulled Helen from nights, had her reassigned effective immediately to a different floor with one phone call to administration. The restriction on Katie's access to patient care had been clarified in an email marked high priority. The message was clear: help him and you're gone. The hospital needed deniability more than it needed a cure. Katie had watched Helen gather her things, had seen the apology in the older nurse's eyes. "I'm sorry," Helen had whispered. Katie had shaken her head, one small movement that said, "You gave me what you could. That's more than anyone else did." At 3:13 a.m., Marcus's heart rate spiked to 142, the monitor chiming its alarm like a bell tolling. Katie stood outside his door and watched the night resident move slowly toward the room, moving like someone crossing water, like someone who'd been trained to see suffering as someone else's responsibility. She felt her hands move. Not toward Marcus. Not into the room. Toward her pocket, where her dog tags rested against her collarbone beneath her scrubs, cold and heavy and real in a way that nothing else in this place was real. Metal that had seen things. Metal that remembered who she was before disappearance. Before nobody. The night stretched ahead like a runway with no landing lights. 6 hours. Maybe less. The math was in the chart and the chart was mathematics and mathematics didn't lie. Katie went back to the staff room and sat in the dark and waited for what would happen when you were standing next to someone dying and every single door was locked. The hospital laundry room smelled like bleach and industrial detergent, the kind that burns the back of your throat if you breathe too deep. Katie had changed back into her scrubs in the staff bathroom at 2:15 a.m., the one she'd kept in her locker since her first day, back when nobody knew her name was anything other than the quiet woman who showed up and worked. Dr. Caldwell had removed her from the roster 3 hours ago, had walked her to the parking lot in front of the morning shift with his hand on her elbow like she was contagious, had told her security would escort her off the premises if she returned. So she'd gone home. Changed clothes. Driven back through the rain. Picked the lock on the staff entrance, a skill that didn't technically exist in her official file, and walked back into Sacred Heart like she still belonged here. Because she did. Because somewhere in pediatrics, a man was dying, and 7 doctors had decided his deafness made him expendable. She'd spent the last 6 hours restocking supply closets on the 3rd floor, moving through the hospital like a ghost, the scrubs invisible against the nighttime corridors. Her badge was gone, but the hallways were dark enough. She knew every exit, every code, every rhythm of this place. She moved like she worked here. Like she had permission. Like she existed. At 2:38 a.m., the monitor alarm on Marcus Webb's room screamed 3 sharp chirps and flatlined into one long, accusatory tone. Katie was 2 doors down, folding linens into a crash cart when she heard it. The sound cut through everything, through the ventilator hiss, through the distant conversation of the night nurse at the station, through the fluorescent buzz that most people stopped hearing after the first week. She knew that alarm. She'd heard variations of it in 3 different countries. That wasn't a warning. That was a goodbye. She moved. Not fast, fast looked suspicious. Just competent. Just like a nurse. The door to Marcus's room was unlocked. It always was, because the rules said cardiac patients needed accessibility in emergencies. The irony that no emergency team was coming made her jaw tighten. The monitor showed ventricular fibrillation. His chest heaving, but not breathing, just the involuntary spasms of a heart trying to remember how to beat. His eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling tiles, and in that fraction of a second when her eyes met his, she saw recognition flicker. 7 doctors had abandoned him. The transplant team had written him off. The chart said comfort care only, which was hospital code for let him go quietly. And now his heart was remembering why it had been trying to reject every option this place had offered. Katie locked the door behind her. The code cart was in the corner, she'd made sure of that, had reorganized this room 3 days ago when she was still pretending to be a regular nurse. Her hands moved on their own, the way they always did when the training took over, when survival superseded everything else. She pulled the combat knife from her boot, the one she'd carried for 9 years, the Benchmade fixed blade she'd used in Kandahar to cut through equipment and uniforms and the barriers between life and impossible situations. The one that had never left her body. Betadine from the crash cart. She soaked the blade, let it yellow under the fluorescent light. 3 seconds. Sterilization was mathematics. Temperature, exposure time, and the chemical composition of iodine. The math didn't care that she was in a hospital instead of a forward operating base. The blade was clean. She marked the intercostal space with her finger, the 4th rib, just below the axilla. Her other hand found the scalpel on the equipment tray, but no. The combat knife was better. Sharper. More familiar. She could feel the exact moment the blade entered between the ribs, the resistance of fascia, the give of the intercostal muscles. One cut. Deep. Sure. A combat medic didn't hesitate in the dark, and hesitation now would kill him. The rib spreaders from the crash cart. Cold stainless steel. She positioned them and turned the handle, and Marcus Webb's chest opened like a door she'd been authorized to unlock by physics and proximity and the simple fact that nobody else was coming. His heart was in front of her. Grey-purple, distended, chaotic. Not beating. Just quivering like something that had given up. She didn't think about the officer who destroyed her career. She didn't think about the tribunal or the sealed records or the 18 years of becoming invisible. She only thought about the private, a 19-year-old from Iowa who'd taken shrapnel in the lower left quadrant, whose heart had felt exactly like this in her hands in the dark outside Fallujah, whose heart had started beating again the moment she'd massaged it with enough pressure and intention and refusal to accept the alternative. Her hand went into Marcus Webb's chest. The muscle was warm, slippery, desperate. She felt the fibrillation under her palm, that panicked, useless flutter. She began the massage, deep and rhythmic, the same motion she'd performed on a stretcher with mortars falling, the same motion she'd learned from instructors who specialized in the medicine of the impossible. Push. Release. Push. Release. Feel the chambers respond. Feel the blood move. Feel the body remember that survival was still an option. The monitor showed a single blip. Then another. Then rhythm. Sinus rhythm. A real, organized heartbeat under her hand. The door exploded inward. Dr. Caldwell stood in the frame with 2 security guards, his face the color of old meat. Katie was still standing there with her hand inside a patient's chest, her fingers still massaging Marcus's heart, the combat knife on the tray, the rib spreaders holding the opening, the monitor now showing a rate of 72 beats per minute with oxygen saturation climbing. Get her out. Caldwell's voice shattered the room. She's finished. Unlicensed procedure. Call the police. Get her off this patient now. The security guards moved toward her. Katie withdrew her hand slowly. Cardiac massage wasn't something you stopped abruptly, not in the middle of a recovery, and stepped back. She didn't resist as they gripped her arms. She didn't pull away as they began moving her toward the door. But as they dragged her past Dr. Caldwell, Katie turned her head and met his eyes with the kind of flat, measured calmness that came from having stared down much worse. When she spoke, her voice was low enough that only he could hear. I was ordered to disappear after a Black Ops mission was buried. Officially, I don't exist. She watched his rage shift. Watched it collapse into something colder. Watched him understand, in that single moment, that he had no idea what he'd been standing next to. Watched the color drain from his face as the math of it recalculated. Then no one will miss you, he said. But he was wrong. The monitor showed 78 beats per minute now. Marcus Webb was still alive, his heart beating under his own power, his lungs breathing on the ventilator, his body refusing to accept the abandonment of 7 doctors and a hospital that had decided his deafness was too complicated to save. 2 hours later, Katie stood in the laundry room folding her blood-soaked scrubs. The room was empty, just the industrial washers and dryers humming their mechanical lullaby, fluorescent lights casting everything in the color of clinical detail. She folded each scrub with military precision, the kind of careful creasing she'd once used on her dress uniform before ceremonies she would never attend again. The blood was dried now, darkened from crimson to burgundy, Marcus's blood, the blood of the man who'd destroyed her career, the blood that had proven she could still do the one thing she'd been trained to do better than anyone else. Around her neck hung a single dog tag on a broken chain. It had fallen off during the thoracotomy, caught on her gloved finger as she'd withdrawn from his chest. The metal was warm from his body. The name engraved on it read Webb, Marcus J., and a serial number she didn't need to memorize because she'd never forget it. She'd been ordered to disappear. She'd been ordered to let him die. She'd been ordered to stop existing. And she had saved him anyway. The fluorescent light hummed its steady note, and Katie folded the final scrub shirt, pressed the wrinkles flat with the heel of her hand, and placed it in the donated clothes bin where it would be incinerated by morning. Evidence destroyed. Trail erased. A nurse who had never existed performing a procedure that never happened on a patient she wasn't authorized to treat. She touched the dog tag hanging against her chest, felt its weight, felt the reality of it, the only proof that she'd been in that room at all. Outside, the rain hammered against the laundry room windows like applause that nobody else could hear. The fluorescent lights in the administrative wing hummed like a swarm of insects as Katie pushed the laundry cart down the hallway at 6:19 a.m., the dog tag still hanging against her chest beneath her scrubs. She had worked the night shift folding blood-stained linens, mechanizing her breathing, pushing every image from 2:13 a.m. into a locked compartment of her mind, a skill she'd learned in Kandahar when you couldn't afford to think about what your hands had just done. She was heading back to the locker room to change out of her uniform for the last time when she heard the first helicopter. It wasn't close enough to rattle windows. It was close enough to change the air pressure in the building. The elevator doors opened on the third floor and Katie froze. 4 men in dark suits stepped out. Then 2 more. They moved with the purposeful synchronization of federal agents, shoulders squared, communication devices in ears. The way they positioned themselves suggested they'd done this before. One of them was studying a tablet with Sacred Heart's header visible on the screen. Another was speaking quietly into his wrist. "We're in. Start the audit." The men moved past her without looking up. Katie stood motionless, her hand still gripping the laundry cart, and watched them head toward the administrator's office. The dog tag felt heavier than it had 30 seconds ago. By 9:15 a.m., security had cordoned off the entire administrative wing. A second helicopter had landed on the roof. This one was moving faster, engines still spinning. Katie had changed back into her scrubs and was sitting in the employee break room, watching nurses whisper in clusters, watching their phones light up with messages none of them understood. Sacred Heart's routine background check system had flagged something. An anomaly in the terminated employee database. A classified security clearance that shouldn't exist in the file of a pediatric nurse who'd been demoted to janitorial work. The hospital's compliance officer had run the check automatically, standard procedure for anyone leaving the facility. The system had triggered a federal alert. And then the phone call started. She didn't move. She didn't check her phone. She sat with her hands folded on the cafeteria table like a suspect waiting for interrogation, because that's what this was going to be. 20 minutes later, Marcus Webb's daughter walked into the cafeteria. She moved the way her father moved, direct, purposeful, with the bearing of someone used to getting answers. She was in her 40s, dark hair pulled back, dressed in professional clothes that suggested she'd driven here straight from somewhere important. Her eye scanned the room once, twice, then locked directly on Katie. She walked across the cafeteria without hesitation and sat down across from her. "Major Rodriguez," she said, and Katie's entire body went still. "My father is asking for you." Katie hadn't heard her military rank spoken aloud in 18 years. The words landed like bullets. She looked up at Marcus's daughter and said nothing because there was nothing safe to say. The woman continued, "I'm Sarah. My father is upstairs. He's stable. He wants you to know he's been looking for you for 5 years. Before that, he was trying to understand why you did what you did. Now he knows." Katie's hands remained folded on the table. Sarah leaned forward. "You saved his life. You saved 14 soldiers that day in Kandahar. He understands that now. He spent 5 years reading after-action reports, piecing together classified documents, trying to find you. This morning when they told him your name, he cried. He asked me to find you immediately and tell you he's sorry. He's so sorry." The cafeteria seemed to be happening at half speed. Katie could hear a coffee machine grinding behind the counter. Could hear someone's phone buzzing. Could see the fluorescent light reflecting off the stainless steel table between them. She opened her mouth and said, "How's his SATs?" Sarah smiled slightly. 96% on room air. The transplant team says he's a candidate now. Something about your procedure changed everything. Katie nodded once. Sarah watched her for a long moment. He said you'd ask about his oxygen level before you asked anything else. He said that's who you are. Upstairs in the administrator's office, a head nurse named Margaret was standing with trembling hands in front of a personnel file that should have been destroyed 2 years ago. The Pentagon official had handed her a court order, federal override, classification authority seal, the whole apparatus of the United States government reduced to a single piece of paper that unlocked redacted sections. Margaret was reading aloud because her voice was all she had left to anchor herself. Major Catherine Rodriguez, Special Operations Combat Medic, Classified Assignment Designation Black Hawk Team Leader, Kandahar Province, 2006 to 2008. Security Clearance, Top Secret SCI Promotion, Major, confirmed 2007. Disciplinary Action, Court-Martial, 2008, Sealed Proceedings, Case File Destroyed per Federal Directive. Medical Notation, Author of 14 Successful Field Interventions under Extreme Combat Conditions. Notable, Operator Survival Rate above 99%. Margaret stopped reading. Her hands shook as she turned the page. Commendation from Joint Special Operations Command, Classified, Field Promotion Authorized, Silver Star Recipient, Authorized Wear and Display Pending Security Clearance Restoration. The nurse looked up at the Pentagon officials standing around the desk. One of them nodded. She continued reading the next page, and the next, watching the redactions disappear line by line as the truth emerged. The SEAL team leader arrived in dress blues that pressed against his uniform like a statement. His name tag read Holloway, and his presence made the air in the hospital boardroom seem to compress, as if the room's oxygen levels had shifted. He stood before the assembled hospital administration, the CEO, the chief of surgery, the compliance officer, the hospital council, and he spoke the way men speak when they're describing classified operations at the unclassified level, with precision, without emotion, and with the absolute weight of authority. Major Catherine Rodriguez served in Special Operations Command, Task Force 121, from 2006 to 2008. A unit operated in Kandahar Province conducting high-priority direct action missions. During a classified operation on October 14, 2007, Major Rodriguez provided emergency medical intervention to 14 operators in the field under active enemy fire. 13 of those 14 operators survived to return to duty. The 14th required 14 hours of continuous resuscitation, but survived. The operation was classified at the TSSCI level. When the Pentagon buried the mission file, they ordered Major Rodriguez to civilian status and classified her service records. She was told her career was over. She was told to disappear. He paused. The room was dead silent. 3 hours ago, I received a call from Joint Special Operations Command informing me that Major Rodriguez had resurfaced at Sacred Heart Hospital in Portland, Oregon, working as a pediatric nurse. 1 hour ago, I learned she performed an emergency field thoracotomy on a Green Beret officer with a rejected heart transplant, using field medicine procedures from her classified training, at 2:06 a.m. last night. That officer is alive because of her intervention. That's why I'm here. Major Rodriguez received the Silver Star for the Kandahar operation. She also received 2 Bronze Stars for secondary operations in the Hindu Kush. She also received a classified commendation from JSOC that I'm not authorized to discuss in this room. What I can tell you is this: you had a decorated combat medic working in your pediatric ward while 7 of your physicians refused to treat a dying Green Beret officer. That's not a medical decision. That's a moral failure. The FBI agent who stepped forward next moved like a man carrying documents that would reshape people's futures. His name was Torres, and he pulled a laptop to the center of the conference table. On the screen, encrypted files. Bank transfers. Patient data. Pharmacy access logs. Dr. Richard Caldwell has been selling patient information to pharmaceutical research companies for 3 years. That's approximately 14,000 patient records sold at an average of $40 per record. Total take, $560,000. When Major Rodriguez witnessed Dr. Caldwell photographing restricted files in the pharmacy archives at 2:07 a.m. on the night of the officer's admission, he recognized the threat. He initiated a systematic campaign of harassment and isolation designed to remove her from the hospital before she could connect the security breach to his criminal activity. He reassigned her away from pediatrics. He demoted her to janitorial work. He made a hospital-wide page calling her Nurse Nobody. Agent Torres pulled up a screenshot. He also attempted to forge her termination records at 4:23 a.m. this morning, trying to erase her from the system entirely before the background check audit completed. That's where he made his mistake. Digital forensics caught the forgery attempt. The timestamps don't match. The signature isn't hers. And when we pulled his computer logs, we found this. Another screenshot. Another encrypted message. He was trying to destroy evidence that she'd witnessed his crime. The door to the boardroom opened and Dr. Richard Caldwell was standing in the doorway in his white coat, still wearing his hospital credentials, still believing he had authority in this room. He opened his mouth to speak and SEAL Team Leader Holloway raised one hand. That was all it took. Silence crashed down like a fist. You denied treatment to a decorated operator. You humiliated a Silver Star recipient. You tried to erase a federal officer from existence. 2 FBI agents moved toward Caldwell from either side of the room. They moved like they'd done this before. The zip of handcuffs being positioned. Dr. Richard Caldwell, you're under arrest for healthcare fraud, wire fraud, obstruction of a federal investigation, and falsification of medical records. You have the right to remain silent. They read him his rights while the hospital board watched. The click of the cuffs. The positioning of his wrists behind his back. One of the agents securing him to their side. The perp walk happened at 10:53 a.m., right when the morning shift change was in full swing. The agents escorted Caldwell through the emergency department where 7 physicians had stood over Marcus Webb's bed and said no. Where Dr. Patterson had thrown a coffee cup at a resident. Where Dr. Hughes had called a patient combative. Where Dr. Okonkwo had cited liability concerns while a man coded on a monitor. The nurses stopped what they were doing. The residents stepped back. The attendings looked away. Dr. Caldwell's eyes were searching for an ally, one familiar face that might suggest this wasn't actually happening, and found none. The security guards who had dragged Katie out of the hospital the night before now held doors open for the agents escorting his arrest. He passed underneath the ER sign he'd supervised for 8 years. He passed the nurses' station where he'd shouted orders. He passed the supply closet where he'd threatened Katie about her employment gaps. And he looked at nobody and nobody looked at him except to remember. 6 months later, Katie sat in the sunlit therapy room at Sacred Heart's Cardiac Rehabilitation Center and watched Marcus Webb lift 2-pound dumbbells with steady hands. His transplant had taken. His scar had healed into a thin white line across his chest that matched the geography of Katie's own survival, visible proof that damage doesn't have to be permanent. He set the weights down, breathing slightly harder than before, and turned to look at her. He signed with his hands, "I destroyed your career for doing the right thing. Why did you save my life?" Katie responded in ASL she'd learned in the months since the arrest, her hands moving with the deliberate precision of someone learning a language in honor of a person, because that's who I am. The mission was saving lives. It always was. Marcus's hands moved again. The classified records say you disobeyed my direct orders in Kandahar. You saw something I missed from command position. You were right. Katie nodded once. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a photograph, Marcus in dress uniform at a Pentagon ceremony, his hand on his chest, receiving commendation. She was standing beside him in the photograph, and she was wearing her dress uniform again. They sat in silence that felt like absolution. The night security guard position at Sacred Heart had specific requirements written into Dr. Caldwell's plea agreement. He worked the night shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., stationed at the main security desk, required to unlock doors for nurses, residents, and attendings who needed access to restricted areas. His name was still visible on the building roster. His medical license was permanently revoked. His 5-year probation included mandatory restitution payments. And he had to watch Major Katie Rodriguez walk through those doors as the hospital's new director of emergency medicine. Katie's badge caught the fluorescent light as she moved through the ER with purpose, consulting on cases, reviewing protocols, ordering systemic changes that made treatment more equitable, more accessible, more human. The badge read, Katie Rodriguez, RN, MSN, Director of Emergency Medicine. On her office wall hung a shadow box containing fur medals arranged in ascending order of prestige, Bronze Star, Silver Star, and beneath them all, a single dog tag on a broken chain. Her nameplate sat on the desk beside a framed note in Marcus's handwriting, Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. She touched the dog tag once each morning, the way some people touch religious medallions, then turned to her work. 17 patient charts needed review. 32 protocols needed updating. A pediatric nurse named Helen, the one Caldwell had reassigned in retaliation, worked under her direction now, trusted and promoted and finally safe. Every morning Katie walked past the security desk where Caldwell sat, and every morning he looked at his hands instead of meeting her eyes. She never acknowledged him. She just continued to her office, where the next patient's life needed saving, where the next person who'd been dismissed might finally be heard, where the work that mattered happened in the quiet hours that nobody else could see. Subscribe for more stories like Katie's, where the truth surfaces and justice finds a way. Like and comment if you believe in second chances and silent heroes.